Story 1. A police officer was working the desk 3 PM to 11 PM. The fire alarm signal goes off. Many years ago, the police department offered an alarm monitoring service, but still had 10 to 12 places that were just hardwired, and it would require pulling apart a lot of equipment to disconnect the system, so we just kept it going. First shift dispatch is already punched in, so she took it. I'm headed out the door to the fire department when 911 rings from the same address. I answer it. No one on the other end. Assumes they barely got to call before passing out. I bolt out the back door, hop in a squad car, radio in the 911 call on channel 3 that both police and fire can hear, and that I'm going directly to the house. I arrive just as another unit shows up. No signs of smoke or anything like that. An older woman comes walking up the street, pushing a wheelchair with an elderly lady, her mother. They live there and just went out for an early evening stroll before dinner. I tell them what we have going on. Nobody else lives there. And as far as the elderly lady can remember, the alarm system was disconnected from the house years ago during some renovations. They don't have any alarm system either, just a couple of smoke and fire detectors. We do a walk around the house, get to the back door of the kitchen, and you can clearly see and smell gas. We turned off the gas at the main, set up some fans to air it out, and found a cracked gas line going to the oven. The daughter said she spilled some coffee she was making for their walk and had to move the oven a few inches to clean it. She probably broke the line pushing the oven back in. Nothing else in the house is disturbed and both phones are on the hook. The fire chief shows up about 15 minutes into the call. He goes over to the two ladies and gives them both a hug. He's nearly in tears. The elderly lady in the wheelchair, her husband was a fire chief over 60 years ago for our department. The daughter, her husband passed away a few years ago. He was also a member of our department. I never believed in ghosts or spirits, but that call made me think maybe people who spend their lives doing good are allowed by some power to look over their loved ones every so often. Story 2. I'm a second-generation firefighter. My father spent the latter days of his career as a fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. Our state version of the OSHA has to come and do inspections at all facilities. His was no exception. So the OSHA inspectors made their way to an abandoned part of the facility that used to house the criminally insane. The absolute worst of the worst. Serial killers, rapists, cannibals, etc. My father left them with keys and a flashlight because electricity didn't work. The inspectors were radioing back to my father that they kept hearing talking and footsteps, which was impossible. Not even squatters could move around because each section is isolated with locked doors to prevent escape. Eventually, the inspectors give up and actually flee without finishing. My dad decided to stick around and check the alarm boxes. They didn't. As he's checking one of the alarms, he feels as if someone is watching him from down the hall. As he looks, a shadow forms with a head, shoulders, and torso but no legs, and just two holes where there should be eyes. My dad noped the hell on out of there. Since the hospital shut down, it's appeared on Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, and many other shows and movies. My dad has been in some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he's ever investigated. Story 3. Where I grew up, there is an abandoned factory that high school and college kids will visit, usually around Halloween, because it's scary enough in the dark. It also houses a decent amount of homeless people, so once every few months, the cops will come in, do a sweep, and force anyone there to leave. One night, my uncle is working and there's a call to the non-emergency line saying there's a lot of movement at the building, that the caller can see light on every floor but the first. My uncle and a few other officers respond. No more than 10 minutes have gone by when my uncle gets there. There's no one around, but there's plenty of light pouring out of the openings where the windows once were. The officers all agree it looks more like fire than flashlights, so they call the fire department as a precaution. They walk into the first floor and start searching for the stairs. They find them and ascend to the second floor. There's no light anywhere. Same with the third, the fourth, and fifth floors. They sweep the entire building, every nook and cranny, even the roof. There's no light source, and no one there that they can find. Fire had arrived shortly after they went in, and they couldn't see anything from the outside other than a subtle glow of flashlights, which was faint, nothing like what my uncle and the others had seen. But my uncle said that what was even more unsettling was that none of the homeless areas, which were usually comprised of piles of trash along with cardboard boxes and blankets, were there. Not that they didn't find any homeless people, but that there was no sign that anyone had been in there at all. Ever. Story 4. I was dispatched around 3 AM to attend a house where the caller was concerned that someone had broken into the basement and was still inside. The caller was a very old lady, and she lived alone. As far as she could tell, she woke up and noticed that the basement lights were on, and she hadn't been downstairs in years. My partner and I get to the call, and the lady is standing at the front door with her walker, anxiously waiting for us to come inside. My partner and I went into the basement, and you can tell that no one had been down there for a while because as I walked, I kept hitting cobwebs that were dangling from the ceiling. Anyway, everything appeared to be in order, and eventually I found the light switch further into the basement and turned it off. We shut the basement door behind us, and cleared the main floor too, since she was so adamant that she heard rustling and coughing in the basement. The basement was relatively empty, and I assure you no one was down there. As we were about to leave, she asks if we could turn the lights off. I said yes, and opened the door to show her, but the lights were back on when I did. I kept my composure and asked her if I could turn the lights on and off from upstairs as well. Negative. My partner and I exchanged looks, and I went back down to turn the lights off again, and get the fuck out. We met up after the call and dug a little bit into the history of the house, and it turned out that a year ago on that day we attended to help paramedics, because her husband had fallen down the stairs. Not sure if he made it or not, but nope. Story 5. Not a cop, but a leasing agent. We deal with a surprisingly high amount of deaths. Brandt was my worst suicide and most creepy. I'll never forget him, and he made sure of that. Brandt was a weird resident, but nice. Always chatted with me, but you could tell he was hurting from his PTSD. Around Christmas, his packages sat too long in the office for pickup, but I figured he was on vacation. Shortly after New Year's, his parents called me and asked to talk to me directly. The manager hands me the phone, and they tell me they haven't been able to get a hold of him for weeks. They live out of state. I tell them to call PD. We're not allowed due to privacy laws, and they grab my keys and head to his apartment. His dog, Rocky, is barking. I check the front door and it cracks open. The smell hits my face like a ton of bricks. And his being dead. Police arrive. Brandt shot himself, and he's been sat there for 10 days. I had to ID him before they called his family. Rocky started to eat him due to going so long without food. The residents above, on the side, and behind him, noped out and we let them go. At this point, I think I'm losing my shit because I keep seeing Brandt out the corner of my eye at work. Only at work. Sometimes I would see him walk by the office windows and I would yell for my manager, who believed me thankfully, but could never see him. About a month after we got his place cleaned up and turned the apartment around, a pair of little Korean sisters moved in next door. The apartment shared a wall with his bedroom. At this point, no one in that area knows what happened because of Brandt being a shut-in. No one knew him, or who he was. Cookie, one of the sisters, comes in and asks me one day if someone died in their apartment. I tell her no. She says a man is around her apartment and is distraught about not being able to cross over. At this point, I ask her if she's seen him, and she describes Brandt. I told her about what happened, and she assured me she'll do a crossover ceremony for him that evening, and also gave me a bit of sage later that day. I never saw or felt Brandt again after that night. Story 6. This happened to me the other night. I was doing nighttime canine training at a local abandoned sanatorium/hospital that is owned by the state. This building is comprised of an old section which was largely converted into offices and a newer section which looks like a standard hospital. We had several guys and their canine partners training that night. All of the dogs stay out in their respective patrol vehicles while they're not being used or trained. For this night, everyone is conducting training in the basement of the newer section of the hospital. They are running scenarios where the dog searches the building and finds a bad guy, and bites the bad guy. My dog isn't in that stage of his training yet, so I go off to another floor of the hospital with my head trainer to do other training. Myself, my pup and my head trainer go to the 3rd floor of the building and begin training. The hospital has a central area which looked to be a nurse's station. Several long hallways lead away from the nursing station, and I'm standing in a hallway with my dog facing that nurse's station. The hallway continues for about another 40 yards behind me and has multiple rooms. I put my dog in a sit-stay and began listening to the instructions from my trainer. Both myself and my dog are focused on what my trainer is saying. While the instruction is going on, my dog looks back at the hallway behind me. Just as he does this, I hear a deep, mumbled male voice behind me. I interrupt the trainer and turn my head to listen. As I turn my head, the voice fades out. Once the voice fades out, my dog looks forward again. I'm a little freaked out at this point. The hospital is locked down tight. We also walked through to make sure no one was squatting. Even if we missed a squatter, you would think that me announcing multiple times, "Police Canine, come out now or announce yourself. If not, I'm sending the dog and you'll be bit," would drive someone out. I believe in ghosts, but I do not think I was hearing the conversation of the other guys training. We were 4 floors away in a large hospital. After this happened, I went looking for the noise and never found anything. This story isn't as shocking as some others in this thread, but it still freaked me out. Story 7. I've spent a chunk of my career working in historic house museums and people constantly ask if they're haunted. I'm not a person who is into ghost stuff, but a good legend does bring in the visitors, so I don't shy from explaining any deaths that have occurred in the house. Recently, I worked at a historic house in a small town where a child was fatally injured falling down the back stairs. She died in the local hospital a few days after the fall, and the story was well known locally. People often reported strange feelings. A team of ghost hunters visited a few years back who claimed they detected a voice and that something fell over during taping. Of course, nothing ever just falls over, and the light over the stairs had been known to flicker before some rewiring was done during a restoration. We also had a summer student who was deeply into this stuff, to the point where she claimed a friendship with the ghost. I scoffed regularly at all this stuff. None of the staff I supervised ever reported anything strange, and I was frequently alone in the house without issues. However, on my third to last day working there, I was in the house with another member of staff, taking them through the daily inspection routine. We were on the 2nd floor when a loud banging came from the back of the house. When we looked into the hallway, a light was on over the back stairs where the fatal accident occurred. Now, I was very careful never to leave lights on overnight because it's bad for the artifacts, and definitely had not turned that light on yet, since we hadn't reached that part of the house. I asked my colleague if she turned it on, and she said no. The banging occurred again, and we basically just bailed completely. In retrospect, I must have left the light on the day before, and the noises probably came from outside, but the confluence of events in the dark old house on a gloomy, cloudy day just made my skin crawl. Story 8. My partner and I received a 911 call from an old woman having a dispute with someone. We get to the house, and she says she is alone. We say, "Who are you having a dispute with?" She says, "Oh, just this spirit in one of my rooms." Immediately, me and my partner look at each other and said the all, "She's elderly, it's probably dementia or something along those lines." We're talking to her. She's explaining how sometimes a bad spirit comes around. She states that he's in the back room, and, of course, the lights don't work. We try to tell her that spirits probably aren't in her house and that we have to get to another 911 call. She insists we check it out. So we do. Now, the house, the way she was speaking about spirits, made me believe something was there. When we got to the room and she opened the door, seeing a ghost wouldn't have shocked me. She did say that it's usually in the corner of the ceiling. Well, that corner was dark and had the freakiest shadow that was legitimately terrifying. My partner and I shone our flashlights on the whole room and thankfully, nothing was there. We told the lady, "Nope, you're good, nothing's going on here." I said to her, "If you feel there's a spirit here, the NYPD cannot help you. Go to a local church or religious institution of your choosing, and best of luck." We got the fuck out of there. Story 9. Leo here. Okay, so I was supervising an evening shift in a small town in rural Australia. We have a large river that snakes its way past the town and runs close to some of the residential areas. It's a kilometer wide in some parts, has steep banks, and thick bush in the bed when it's dry. One of my crews was tied up with something, and the other was attending 2 brothers threatening suicide after fighting at a residence near the bank of the river. I heard the job and attended to give my crew a hand. Upon arrival, we found one brother who was self-harming and on drugs. We restrained him to prevent him from harming himself. He was telling us he wanted to kill himself and was taken to hospital via ambulance for mental health. As we had made the apprehension, my crew had to accompany the ambulance for everyone's safety. My crew leaves, and then I'm told by the family that the other brother has run off down the river's dry bank, threatening to hang himself. The family said he was drunk, but didn't have anything to actually hang himself with. I was concerned, and attended the riverbank near where they thought he went down the river's steep bank. Both crews were busy, and I was by myself. At night, and it started raining lightly. I parked my unit at the top of the bank with the lights pointed onto the bush, hoping that if he saw my lights, he'd come towards me. I got out my torch and made my way down the bank. I found a small clearing, and a small distance away was a thick bush. I heard something moving in the bush. It sounded like something taking deliberate steps in the bush. I yelled out, thinking it was the guy I was after. I told him I was there to help, and pleaded with him to come out. No response, and when I was talking, whatever it was stopped moving. I kept talking, attempting to make contact, as my instincts told me there was someone in the thick bush in front of me. No response. My torch couldn't penetrate the bush, but I could hear distinct footfalls. I stopped making any noise, turned off my light, and stood still listening. I hear movement coming towards me in the bush. I remained still and listened. It came closer. Without thinking, my hand went down to my gun, and I was ready to draw. I turned on my light and walked forward and heard whatever it was moving away from me. I backed off, turned off my light, and remained silent. It started coming closer to me, probing my position. I repeated the exercise once more, and once more it backed off, and came back at a different angle. By this stage, I was on high alert. Something told me, get the fuck out. I got this heavy, eerie feeling. Any animal that was down there would have run off upon my approach. No animal I know approaches or probes a human position at night like that. Once I got the overwhelming feeling to leave, I backed off, with my hand on my gun, and I didn't turn my back until I had to climb up the bank. Once at the top and back with my car, I felt a lot better, but I could still hear something moving in the bush. I stayed there for a while as I was curious. I left and conducted inquiries finding the missing brother on the other side of town, fast asleep and fine. To this day, I don't know what I ran into in the riverbed that night. Story 10. I spent some time as a homicide investigator. We would respond to all apparent suicides and investigate them just to make sure it wasn't a homicide. Usually we determined a motive for suicide and found a note or other indicator that the person killed themselves. One guy just taped a note to his chest that said, "Happy now, bitch," and made sure his wife found him after he hanged himself. But occasionally you get a case where all forensic evidence indicates that the person killed themselves, but there's no note and no discernible reason why this person would be suicidal. These are people in good health, with decent careers and a seemingly happy family life, but who knows what's really going on with someone. Here's the part that freaks me out. I've worked maybe 10 suicides like this. The last 3 before I left homicide all had the same thing at the scene. There was a little decorative wicker lighthouse at each location. It was the same lighthouse, same design, and painted white and blue. It stuck out to me the first time because it was by the bed where the body was. But 2 weeks later I saw the same damn lighthouse on another suicide and even pointed out the coincidence to a patrol officer. A few months later, I go on another suicide and I see that same wicker lighthouse. That's when it clicks that it's always been unexplained suicides. I go back and look at crime scene photos from every suicide I've worked. In 2 of them, I see what could be the wicker lighthouse, but the angle is off and there's too much junk around to say for sure. I don't know. I thought it was creepy as hell, but I transferred a couple of months later and I let it go. Edit. Well, that got more of a response than I was anticipating. To answer the question of, was it a serial killer? I very much doubt it. These were clearly suicides, most of which had no feasible alternative explanation. We work every suicide as if it were a homicide. An apparent suicide is almost always a suicide, but we err on the side of caution. Also, while serial killers are actually more common than most people think, they rarely leave calling cards or anything like you see in the movies. It's usually some fucked up dude that has a particular taste. I really do think it was an odd coincidence, but it was still pretty fucking creepy. Story 11. I've been in law enforcement for nearly 6 years and I've had a few supernatural things occur during my shifts. The most recent one came from a 911 hang-up call. It was on a summer night and it was probably around 2 or 3 AM when we got a call for a 911 hang-up. The only call comments was a call placed to 911 and upon answering it, the person hung up. When dispatch attempted to call the number back, no one answered. The area in which I was working this night, I have basically spent my whole career in. There aren't a whole lot of streets I had yet to respond to. However, the address this call came in from, they used GPS coordinates to find the closest location since the caller hung up, I had never been to. I had driven past this road many times but never actually received a call from it. We pull up to this old dirt road and it has a metal chain going across the entrance with a sign that says no trespassing. Because we have to figure out what's going on, me and my partner continue up this long dirt and gravel road. The road was maybe about 100 yards long. The shitty part was that on each side of the road was a tall chain link fence. Why this was crappy was because me and my partner were now walking down a fatal funnel. If there happened to be a guy waiting for us at the end of this road with, let's just say, an assault rifle, we would have no place to take cover. Thankfully this didn't happen. We eventually reach the end of the road and there are 2 houses on each side. At first we believe one of these houses is where the 911 call had come from. As I am shining my flashlight at one of the houses, I see a figure move from inside. Instantly I'm like, oh shit, people actually live back here, as I thought for sure the houses were going to be vacant. Shortly after, a man and a woman walk outside and ask what's going on. We tell them we received a 911 hang-up call from the address 123 Main made up, and asked if they are called. The man tells us his address is 124 Main, and the one across the street is 125 Main, which he says is vacant. He proceeds to tell us that there is a 123 Main, which is basically in the middle of these tall weeds and forest-looking area just to the north of his house. He says the house is vacant and run down and can only be reached on foot. I ask him how far away it is from his house, and he says probably a couple of football fields away. Now, while all this walking and investigating was going on, we had received 2 more 911 hang-up calls. Same address, same result. Before we made this trek out into the middle of the woods, we called for another car, and eventually another 2-man unit responded. The 4 of us now wandered out into the woods, 2 of us with our assault rifles out, and followed a barely beaten path to where we assumed we would find a house. Fighting spiderwebs and low-hanging tree branches, we eventually reach our destination. I'm terrible at describing things, but this house was straight out of any horror movie you want to imagine. It was run down, had a tree that had fallen through the middle and had now been incorporated with the house throughout the years. The house was nearly falling apart and was completely overgrown by greenery. Having come this far, we decided to move on, even though we were pretty sure the house would be vacant. After fighting through some thick brush, we find our entrance. We each have to climb over some fallen brick walls and other wooden shit before we actually make entry. My biggest fear at this point is this stupid rotten house collapsing on itself and being trapped inside with no one being able to find us. We search the entire house, and like we thought, no one inside. And when I say we searched the entire house, I mean the entire house. Nothing was left unchecked. Feeling satisfied, we all climb our way back out of the bullshittery and started heading back towards where the 2 original houses were. As we walk back, dispatch radios us and tells us they received another 911 hang-up call coming from the same address. This time, dispatch tells us they were able to make call back, and when the person answered, they could hear what sounded like a child playing on the phone. The 4 of us looked at each other and decided we were done with this call. We had done everything we could up to that point, and were not about to get called back into possibly a demon's house because a child was on the phone. We clear the call and don't receive any more 911 hang-up calls for the rest of the night. Fast forward maybe 6 months, and it's dead-ass cold winter. 911 hang-up from the same address. This time it's me and 3 guys who weren't there previously. I tell them the story of what happened, and all 3 were super psyched and wanted to check it out. The 4 of us walk back to this house, now much easier to get to, since the cold had killed off a lot of the greens. The 3 of them decide to go into the house. I wait outside, as I already had my fun. They don't make it too far once they realize this house is about to collapse on itself. We all leave again. No call back from a child this time. If I ever go out there again, I'll try and get a picture of the house, just so when I tell other people this story, they can have a better understanding of how fucked this house actually is. The end. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.